Alrighty, I'm back at it. Got the box, glued it up in the last video, and the next step is to cut the top off. Since I shot that last video, a lot's happened. I've retired from teaching. I brought a bunch of stuff home from my shop, and so or from school, and everything was covered with stuff here, old projects, books, or whatever. So cleaned everything up. Things are a little bit neater now. I put away some material and I'm good to go. Now in that process, I actually found another box that I had started working on a while ago, probably a couple of years ago. This one also has a walnut surround or sides. This I think is cedar bottom. The top is mahogany, but I've glued on some redwood burl veneer on the top to give it a little different look. So this one, of course, has the top cut off and the hinges are on it. I haven't yet to put the interior pieces in yet, but I might be referring to that in a bit. Anyway, back to this one. Before I cut the top off, I want to sand or smooth the outside of the sides a bit. They're basically straight off of my planer, and so they're relatively smooth, but obviously not as smooth as I would like. So I could hand plane these, but I think it's going to be easier just to sand them. So I'm going to put this in the vise and do a little bit of sanding. I did have a little bit of squeeze out at one corner here, so that this was the corner that did not have the tape on it. On the ones with the tape, when I folded the box up during the glue up, I think the squeeze out mostly went to the inside, but on this last corner it's on the outside. So I'm going to go ahead and sand this, and we'll get it smooth, and then we'll cut the top off. I've got the box clamped on my bench here between some dogs, just very lightly clamped. I don't want to overdo it here. And this is relatively smooth, so I'm going to start with 120 grit. My sanding blocks are two-sided, hard on one side and cork on the other. I typically use the hard side up to about 150 and then switch to the cork side. So I'm just going to go through the grits here on each side, and pretty straightforward. I want to, of course, make sure I'm keeping everything flat. I would not take a random orbital sander to this, something this small. Just going to keep things nice and flat and get it smooth. Okay, that's looking good. Hold it up to the light. Make sure there's no rough spots. I did have to resand one of the sides. Once I got to the final grit, there were still some spots I'd missed early on. So that's ready to go. Next up, we will cut the top off. So I need to determine where I'm going to cut. And on this box, I came down, I don't know, about 3/4 of an inch. That gives me a little bit of room around the inside here, which I need. It's going to make it easier to install the hinges. I need enough thickness here to make sure that the hinge screws have some place to go. So somewhere in that range is going to work out fine. This box is a little bit on the low side. These pieces ended up being a little bit narrow just because I was trying to squeeze them out of that original piece of walnut. So I want to minimize the kerf when I cut the top off. So I typically do this on the table saw. I'll, of course, set the fence and just make 4 cuts. You could do it on the bandsaw, but the bandsaw leaves a relatively rough cut, and I'm going to get a better cut on the table saw to minimize the kerf, I'm going to use a blade from a portable circular saw. So they're, I think, 7¼ diameter, but they're much thinner. They're about half the thickness of a regular table saw blade. I don't have a thin kerf 10-inch table saw blade, so that circular saw blade is going to work great. I've got a hollow ground blade that's supposed to give smooth cuts. I tested it out on something and it's cutting nicely. I think I got that idea from Steve Latta. I think he talks about using those blades when creating stringing. So anyway, I'm going to head over to the table saw and set up to make those 4 cuts. So I've got my circular saw blade in there. You can see it's a relatively small diameter. It's not carbide, but the hollow ground blades, they actually grind part of the blade away to provide a little bit of clearance. So it's a pretty thin blade, about 1/16 of an inch kerf. So I've got the fence set about 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to, or I've set the height of the blade a little bit thicker than the thickness of my parts. I don't want to raise it up a lot. I don't want to be cutting, 2 inches high, because if the blade was slightly out of square, then it would mess up my cut when I cut that way. So I basically want to go as low as possible. I'll start, I want to end on a cut on this long surface so it's most stable. I don't want to end with a cut like that. So I'm going to start here and then I'll just rotate around and, well, I guess that means I need to start here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I need to start on the end. We'll go ahead and do that and see how it turns out. Okay, let's see here. That looks a little bit of burning there, but the corners, those are pretty flush. All my cuts look good. Once again, a little bit of burning on that, but that'll sand off. And that fits nicely there. I did, at the last cut, I should have been a little more careful. At the end, I was pushing this way, and this moved into the blade just a touch. I should have been a little more careful about just pushing forward, but I think it's fine. Next, I need to get these cut surfaces nice and flat, get rid of the burning. So I've got a piece of MDF here with some 80 grit sandpaper glued to it with contact cement. This is off of a wide belt sander, which I had access to when I was teaching. If I did not have this, I would glue down a full sheet of maybe 100 grit sandpaper. You really want to make sure it's glued down to something, because if it's not, the edges are always going to curl up a little bit, and you're going to slightly round these edges, and you're not going to get this nice fit, right? You can barely tell where that seam is there. If this had rounded at all, you'd see a gap there. So you really want to keep this flat. So this is the only grit I have. So I'll have to finish it with finer grit, but at least to start, to get rid of the burning, I'm going to start with this 80 grit. I've got the top done, and I'm working on the bottom now, and I'm been working to just maybe about a minute so far, and I can see some mismatches here where the cut stopped and started. You can see the depth of cut there, a little burning here. So I need to go until those lines are gone. That'll tell me when I'm done here. So as I'm doing this, I'm sanding and I'm rotating. I'm sanding. I'm coming in from the other direction. I want to make sure I keep turning this, because if I keep going the same direction, we just have a tendency to, and I think just because of the geometry and the physics, as I'm pushing, it tends to dig in a little bit on the far side. So to make sure that I'm sanding this evenly, I'm turning this often as I'm sanding to even things out. So I've gotten rid of those lines now, and I think it's pretty flat. A little bit of burning there, but so I'll go ahead and get rid of the burning. But I did want to point out the last thing I want to do is do this in a circular motion. That helps, I find, get rid of the sanding scratches, because they tend to be linear for the most part. So after I get rid of that burning, I'll finish by doing circular motions, lightening my pressure, and that should pretty much get rid of the vast majority of the sanding scratches. I'm happy with that. I think I've got that nice and flat. All right, you can feel that air or hear that air cushion there. So that's a good sign. If it, hit solid, I know that it wasn't flat. So that's great. So, that 80 grit paper I was using was relatively worn. It was a used piece that came off a wide belt sander. So this actually got this pretty smooth for 80 grit. So I'm just going to finish up with some, not even 180, some 240, just to get any little scratches out of there. And then we'll go ahead and work on the hinges. So I'm going to be very careful. I'm using just the hard side because I don't want that cork to conform any. And I'm just going to, make sure that the paper's flat against the block, and I'll just work very carefully around the whole edge to get rid of those scratches. Okay, so that looks good. Now these edges are pretty sharp now, so I want to knock those down a little bit. So I'm just going to take some 320 and knock those down so they're not quite so sharp. Of course, I can knock them down more on the inside than the outside. I want to keep the outside a little bit sharper just to hide that seam. So I'm just maybe a few passes there. And I'll do the inside a little bit more. And I should point out one of the things that I think notes, great craftsmanship from good craftsmanship is when you're doing something like this. If I just went back and forth and said I was done, I wouldn't get into the corners quite as much. So I like to, when I come into a corner, I kind of work that corner a little bit. Now, on something this small, you're not really going to notice it, but on a bigger project, you notice those things. You notice when the corners aren't done as well as some of the other parts. So I'll work just a touch more on these corners to make sure that this round over is consistent from edge to edge there. One last thing I'm going to do before I finish here is I've just got some sandpaper, and this is 320, which is the finest I'm doing here. And I'm just going to sand with the grain on each of these edges. It's a little hard to do that with a sanding block because you're always hitting two edges at a time. And as I'm doing that, obviously I'm trying to keep this flat. I'm not taking off much material, but I'm if anything pushing a little harder towards the inside, so that if I do take off a little extra material, you're not going to see it from the outside. So just a little bit here, just to kind of clean up any minor scratches there. And then the last thing I'm going to do before I go to the hinges, I have, there was a little bit of squeeze out. There's actually just only 2 drops inside here of glue. I'm not sure you can see it there, but I'm going to take my chisel and come down very carefully from the top to clean that up, and then we'll get to the hinges.